simplest way to understand the history of the Book of Psalms, also called the Psalter, is to think of it as a hymnal. If you pick up a copy of the hymnal 1982, which is the normative hymnal in the Episcopal Church, you look right there on the cover, it says 1982, but you wouldn't think that every song written in that book was written in the 80s. That book contains songs from 1,000 years ago, from hundreds of years ago, from the 19th century, songs that were written shortly before the hymnal was published. It encompasses centuries and centuries of Christian music, all within a single book. And the Psalms are almost the exact same. The Psalter, as we currently have it, is actually a fairly late document by Old Testament standards. It probably comes from the Greek period around 150 BC or so. But that said, contained within it, some of those texts are extremely old. The oldest is probably Psalm 29, and we know that because the Hebrew in there is archaic. There's a lot of repetition of phrases. The imagery used for God is of God as sort of this storm deity. It's a very Canaanite kind of hymn. And then fast forward a little bit, we've got the royal David Psalms that are very clearly about a united monarchy in Israel, and that was about 1000 BC or so. We have Psalms from the Babylonian exile, Psalms that recall the story of Moses and contrast that with the people of Israel being pulled out of their homeland and taken into captivity in Babylon, which is in the 6th century BC. We have Psalms about the rededication of the temple, like Psalm 30. That is a very late period. So the Book of Psalms is just a record of centuries and centuries and centuries of Jewish thought and Jewish prayers. So eventually, at a very late date, someone came along and compiled them all into this thing that we call the Book of Psalms, put them in a very specific order, arranged them in 5 books that kind of loosely correspond with the 5 books of Moses, and gave them headings, gave each psalm a title, or at least a little annotation. It might say this psalm is of David, or this psalm is of Moses, or this psalm was very specifically written by David after being confronted by Nathan the prophet over his affair with Bathsheba, things like that. So these psalms were compiled for a very particular reason. They started off as poems or pieces of folk music, pieces of poetry written by royal scribes, but eventually they were put together as basically a hymnal for the Second Temple period, to be sung by community in worship. And we know that they were sung over and over and over again. The Mishnah tells us this. They were sung in the temple. The Septuagint backs that up. The New Testament quotes 60 psalms. I think it's 93 citations in the New Testament, and particularly represents people quoting them from memory. Jesus on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Into your hands I commend my spirit. Peter and Paul being called to defend their faith, and them themselves calling on the Book of Psalms because those are the words that came to mind. So you can imagine that way back when the Book of Psalms was first put together, it was very similar to how we have the Bible, but then we also have a hymnal. They had the Torah and they had the Psalms. So this was the musical and cultural prayerful DNA of the early faith traditions that the people who founded Christianity had written on the tablet of their heart. Fast forward a little bit, we know from Athanasius and Tertullian and the Apostolic Constitutions that chanting of psalms was very, very present in early Christian liturgy. In Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, he says, when you come together, every single person brings a hymn or a psalm, and the word there is psalmos. And you'll notice that we keep hearing each of these people talking about psalms being sung or chanted. The word psalm itself is a Greek word that means essentially music from plucking a stringed instrument like a guitar or a lyre. That's what psalm means. And tehillim, which is the Hebrew word for psalm, is very similar. Literally means praises, but is often used in musical contexts. So these songs that were sung in the early temple period, in the early church, monasticism gets invented, the Egyptian desert fathers, and Benedict comes along, and Benedict forms the rule of St. Benedict, which says you need to be praying the Psalms, all 150 of them, every single week. You have to get through the whole book, cover to cover, every 7 days. And into the medieval period, as monasticism becomes more and more highly regarded as the model for all Christian vocation, all secular clergy, all priests need to start praying the Psalms in the same way, keeping the daily office. The Reformers come along in the Renaissance, and they throw out a whole lot of liturgical tradition, but they keep the Psalms. In fact, John Calvin says very, very specifically the only kind of singing that should be allowed in worship is psalm singing, because it's the only kind of singing that is biblically mandated. So he writes, he puts the psalms into the vernacular, he metricizes them, he makes them the people's music, and this continues. The first book ever published in America was the base psalm book. That was the first thing that people put on paper when they got here. So the important thing to realize about the Book of Psalms is that from thousands of years ago up until very recently, they were the music of our faith. They were the things that people sung in church, by themselves, in personal devotions. And eventually they started to get it supplanted by things like Lutheran hymns and Wesleyan hymns and shape note singing and gospel music. But they're still sung. It's still the only piece of scripture that we hear every single week in the lectionary, and that's why.